Australia at the moment supplying around 50% of the world's lithium, and we're doing that as essentially rocks. 98% of the value downstream is being done overseas. So we have a huge opportunity to step into that in this country and do more processing around the lithium, do it in a healthier, decarbonised way. Australia's done incredibly well, one of the highest, if not the highest in the world when it comes to engagement with solar. From a startup perspective, it's put us in a really great position because it means that a lot of the grid challenges, a lot of the business models that might not be available overseas because they don't have those sorts of things going on in their communities, they're available here, and our startups have learnt what those are and they can export those learnings overseas. I think for me, I've always loved doing innovation. It's incredibly exciting work. But what I've learned about myself is when you add, I guess, a more clear purpose around the environment and the economy, well, that just takes it to the next level.
Hi, and welcome to Responsible Innovation 100. I'm Shahan Drummond, and today we are going to talk about responsible innovation in climate sustainability. To help us dive into this topic, we have Megan Fisher, who is the CEO of Energy Lab based in Melbourne, Australia. Energy Lab is Australia and New Zealand's largest climate tech startup accelerator and innovation network, focusing on reaching net zero emissions. Energy Lab supports talented founders in clean energy and climate tech and connects them to mentors, advisors, partners, peers, and investors to help them succeed. With a background in product management and innovation, Megan has end-to-end management experience in commercializing, developing, and scaling products, plus driving novel innovation initiatives from pilot all the way through adoption. Megan used to work in corporate, but later moved to not-for-profit to have a positive impact on the climate tech startup ecosystem in Australia. Over the next hour or so, we will cover innovation management topics, including 1, the role of community and collaboration, 2, the importance of inclusivity and equality, 3, the 2 valleys of death for Australian startups and how we can navigate this challenge, and 4, corporate innovation and transformation. So first of all, a huge welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining our program, Megan.
Thanks, Shahan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to this today. Thank you for having me.
So to open, Energy Lab was founded in 2017. What motivated the founding of the lab, and how has the company's mission and journey evolved over time?
Yeah, so we're really here. Our mission's always been about decarbonisation. And we do that through helping the founders that are working on the business models and the technology that can actually do decarbonisation. So we help them to grow up as startups, and once their technologies and business models are rolled out, they'll help us decarbonise the economy. And that was what motivated the directors back in 2017 to start the organisation. So we've always been focused in that decarbonisation space. There wasn't back then much support for startups that were operating in clean energy or climate technologies as it's more known now. So the founders really wanted to do something about that. They saw other organizations internationally, particularly in California, really supporting their ecosystems, and there wasn't that sort of support in Australia for the types of organizations that we work with. There were general accelerators, but not somebody really diving into the clean energy space.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I think not long ago that the conversations around climate tech were still somewhat controversial, when now most people do accept that there's a climate issue and they do want to get involved with the climate change and climate sustainability. So back then, when you first started as a company, have you changed any strategies, or it's been quite...
Yeah, we've definitely evolved over time. So there's been things that have always been there. So we've always helped founders with capacity building. So building up their capability to run their organizations, to understand where they need to go to create the learnings. And to do that, we run programs. We've always connected them to access, like helping them access the expertise they need to grow, whether it be startup advisors or experts in a particular technology or industry. We've always done that. Access to funding's always been a big thing, always is. So helping startups to connect with angel investors and venture capital and family offices and the grants that we have in the country to help them fund their growth has always been there. But there's a few things that have changed. Firstly, when we started, the ecosystem, even though it was there, it was relatively new. There's been a lot of change in the startups that operate in this space. So when we started, we were doing a lot of early stage programming. We were doing a lot of hackathons just to drive the interest and the engagement in the sector and help founders that were very early on in their journey. That's definitely changed. So now a lot of the startups that we've worked with from the very beginning are growing. They're doing $10 million and $20 million rounds. They've got a lot of staff themselves. So, and their needs are changing. So they might need help from us at the moment with international expansion. What's it like to take an Australian company and sell products to America or to Europe or to Asia? So we've evolved to be able to cater as the startup ecosystem has really matured. There's no doubt about the fact that there's been a change in interest over the last few years, definitely with the change of government last year. That's created, I guess, a settling now that the climate emergency is occurring and that we need to get on with the work that needs to be done to decarbonise our economy and help other economies around the world do the same. So that definitely created more interest. And there's also been this huge change, particularly after COVID and some of the supply chain issues that have been caused around there, a real focus on energy security. So how do we firm up our supply chain around energy? How do we participate in some of the different emerging capabilities, such as batteries, so that we in Australia have our own supply and can guarantee it? So that's definitely changing some of the focus and the way that we work into the ecosystem.
Can you share some examples of successful startups that Energy Lab has supported over the years? What do you think has been the key to their success?
It's always different. If the startup journey was always the same, everyone would be able to replicate it. But it never is. It really does depend on what they're doing and who they are and what their next growth patterns are. So there's a couple that I'd like to share about. The first is Amber Electric. So Amber Electric are a disruptive retailer. So they're based out of Melbourne. The wonderful Dan and Chris are the co-founders there. And they joined an accelerator of ours quite a number of years ago, 2018, I believe that was. So they've gone on to be an incredibly successful organisation, giving customers an option, a different option to the other retailers that exist in Australia. They effectively offer them the wholesale cost of energy for a subscription price. But they've also hired a whole lot of people. So they're great for the economy. They're great for the transition to renewable energy. And we're really proud to be associated with them. And actually, they've grown up so much now that last year they were a partner, an energy partner in our Scale Up program. So working with the startups that we were bringing in to work with commercial companies. So that's just been so exciting to have that happen. Another startup that we've really enjoyed working with, and they're an alumni twice of our programs, our Scale Up program and our acceleration program, is InfraVision. So they're very different. They're a B2B organisation. They're New South Wales based. And what they've created is this technology and capability to string power lines using drones. Now, power line stringing might sound like, why is that important? Well, the fact is we need a whole lot of transmission to be able to cater for the renewables that need to come into our electricity grid. So being able to be more efficient with doing that work is important. But the other side of it is around safety. So quite often power lines are built using helicopters, which is incredibly dangerous work. So the drone capability is much safer for them. So we've worked with them twice, and most recently we actually did some work with them on their international expansion. So with a partner of ours, New Energy Nexus, who are based in California and all over the world, we've helped them to be able to create that next level and expand overseas. And they've recently announced an incredible contract with PG&E based in California. So they've really changed as well. So that's just a couple, but there's many, many more. We've worked with 150 startups. 150 startups have gone through our programs.
Which is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're really proud of the alumni that we've got in there. The fantastic thing about the ecosystem changing and evolving and growing up is that those alumni founders can now be incredibly helpful for the up and coming founders of the future. So you create this virtuous cycle of growth and development and learning in our own ecosystem, which is great to see.
When you first met those founders, what was the qualities that made you think, oh, these startups are quite different to, they really stand out?
Yeah, I think it's, and InfraVision I definitely work with more often. Amber Electric, when they were just starting out, they were a little bit before my time at Energy Lab. But in terms of founders and what it takes, I would say it depends. And I'd hate to fall into the, I don't know, some of the challenges that we have around the successful founder archetype or stereotype, because I think it prevents the diversity, and we'll get onto that later, I know, but some of the diversity that we need. But some of the things that I see in founders are that they really understand the space that they're trying to transform. So whatever that might be, they've experienced it, they really get it, they're passionate about it. That's always essential and incredibly important. And that would probably be the one thing that I would leave with everyone. That matters. Be passionate about your idea, understand your idea inside and out, and be dedicated to it. And in both of the instances for those founders, that was them through and through.
I have a question about the general trends. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing the clean energy industry in Australia today? And how is Energy Lab working to address them?
Yeah, that's right. And in terms of clean energy and climate tech, because we do both, because it's all decarbonisation. And it's worthwhile saying at the beginning, a lot of our work was more in the clean energy space, because that was the clearest pathway and the pathway with the most advanced technology and business models for decarbonisation. So we spent a lot of time working with, as I mentioned before, disruptive retailers or virtual power plant providers, those in the EV space, lots of organisations that help manage the changes that are needed in the grid. There's a lot of support and technology and business model advancement that's required in there, and that can work with transmission and distribution companies. And more recently, although they've always been there, there are decarbonisation opportunities that are broader than that. So in the built environment, in industry, in agriculture. So we're seeing more and more companies that might be working on alternative protein, or how to transform heating and cooling in buildings, which is a huge user of energy, or managing carbon sequestration in soil with farmers. So there's this broadening trend around what the decarbonisation opportunities are and those emerging business models and technology. So that's probably one of the clear trends. The other opportunity that's really come up recently that's been really exciting to work in actually is around lithium. So in October last year, we kicked off a new project with our partner New Energy Nexus called Supercharge Australia. And what it's looking at is the lithium battery value chain and how can we create more innovation in it for Australia. And why is that important? Well, Australia at the moment is supplying around 50% of the world's lithium. And we're doing that as essentially rocks. So we're digging it up out of the ground and shipping it off overseas, where all the processing happens, when it gets turned into the components for batteries, EVs. We're not seeing any of that. 98% of the value downstream is being done overseas. So we have a huge opportunity to step into that in this country and do more processing around the lithium, do it in a healthier, decarbonised way, create the components for batteries, create battery packs, assemble battery packs, create the EVs, and really importantly, put in place the capability for recycling all of those, for the lithium and all the other critical minerals associated with it. So that's been a new trend for us, or an emerging area of focus more recently, where we can play a really big role. And we've just actually launched an innovation challenge where we've got 11 startups that are going through that program right now. And it's just been really interesting for me, number one, to learn about the space. Clean energy I get, but the dive into the lithium battery value chain has been really new. But we've got some amazing startups already operating in this space. I was lucky enough to be in Perth the other week, and I got to go and visit actually this organization called Renewable Metals, and they do the recycling bit. So they get battery packs, they break them up effectively, and then they use processes to extract back out all of the critical minerals. And I got to see their pilot plant. It was just really interesting to see. And then we've got organizations like Rove, who are creating conversion packs for utility vehicles. So converting them from ICE, from internal combustion engines, into electric vehicles. So there's lots going on in that space. So for us, that's been probably a really big change in trend. The one thing that it has stayed true the whole entire time is the fact that this sector, the decarbonisation sector, clean energy and climate tech, is complex. It's not really throw out an app and everyone will buy it and it's fine. The market structures, particularly in energy, that sit around this are incredibly complex. The technology is complex. The procurement, so if you're selling B2B to a utility or a large organisation, is complex. So founders in this space still need a lot of assistance to be able to navigate those things. It's still complex and the timelines are longer. So whether you're a startup, an investor, or engaged in this sector, it does look quite different to some of the other technology sectors that are around.
Yes, it's such a complex area to work in, which then is linked to our first topic, which is about the importance of community and collaboration. The first question I have for you there is, how has Energy Lab worked with community to drive impact? And what has been some of the successes or challenges of these collaborations?
I guess community and the network and the ecosystem, that's what we do. We enable effectively founders to access the networks of power or finance in a way that they might not have been able to before. So it's really important that we're connected in with that community. So we're all about the power of our network. Over time, we've got over 300 mentors that are part of our network that might be startup advisors, or they might be experts in a particular technology, or at a particular organization, or international expansion, or setting up a company, the legal aspects of a particular partnership or deal. So there's 300 of those incredibly important people in our network. We have 160 angel investors. So they're really important for that early stage pre-seed seed funding that startups need to kick themselves off and get off the ground. So those people are again a really important part of our network. Then we have connections with the family offices and the venture capital firms that invest in this space, that understand this space. And then there's our founders, the 150 founder alumni that we mentioned before. So that community is incredibly important to us. It's all about growing, working with, talking to that community so that we can leverage that community to help the next group of founders that are really coming through. In terms of challenges in that space, it's always having the time. We're a small team of people running programs with founders, helping founders. So finding the time aside to really work with our community is something that we try and make sure that we set aside, and having the technology to understand who's good at what, or even in our own minds, like who's good at what. If this startup needs this, so how do we connect them to that? That's always important. And then the other challenge, which is probably a good one to have, with 300 mentors, we can't have all of them engaged all of the time. So making sure that mentors get a really good opportunity to work with the startups that they want to work with or work on the topics they want to work with is the other thing to ensure that they're having a great time when they're actually working with us as part of our mentor network.
I have a side question from that. So
Mm.
apart from the VCs, your networks, in your space, who are the key players? So just for those people who don't know much about your sector, the government, I assume, is a huge player.
The key players. So there's I guess we're an entrepreneurial support organization. So that's what you'd call Energy Lab. There's quite a few different versions of us in Australia that might be focusing on different sectors to us. So always important, but the government's equally important, both the federal government and the state government. And they're important for startups because they offer grants and funding that can help startups get through. So the Accelerating Commercialisation Grant that the federal government offers is $1 million grant that can help startups commercialise their products. It's really important. The New South Wales government, for instance, has a series of clean tech grants that are on offer at various times in the year. They kicked off maybe 1.5 years ago now, that again can help with R&D, commercialisation, scale up. So that again, the federal state government's really important. And then there's finance organisations. So the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, another important one for funding. If you're energy focused, ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, very important, has played a critical role in helping get pilots off the ground. So those are just some of them. They're certainly the ones that come front of mind for me to really help startups, aside from the VCs and the family offices who play an incredibly critical role as well. And well, there's partners, but partners can be anybody. So it can be any commercial arrangement that you need to have. Many of the startups we work with look for partnerships with other energy companies. So it might be organisations like the transmission, distribution, retail or generator organisations, or those that are doing EV rollouts. There's many of those sorts of organisations as well.
I have a question about how can communities be better engaged in the clean energy transition, so the broader community?
Yes.
And what role do you see for startups and entrepreneurs in this process?
Yeah, I think the more, and I'm going to go back a step. So there's been a lot of, in the past, confusion created around climate change. A lack of understanding enables people to be taken advantage of with maybe media that's not quite factually correct, or stories that aren't quite factually correct. I'm not saying it's the media, but definitely stories that might not be factually correct. So that level of education of the community and keeping things really simple is important, because not everybody in the community wants to deep dive into the ins and outs of the energy system, or solar or wind or hydrogen or any of those things. It's not what we need and should expect people to do. So how to keep what it is we're working on simple and easy to understand and factually based is really important. So definitely for organisations like Amber Electric that we mentioned before, they're a simple value proposition that they promote, and helping people understand what it is they do so that they can engage in it is really important. And I would say that for any startup, how do you keep your messages simple and easy for people to understand, particularly for many of the geniuses that we work with in this space who are technical geniuses solving really hard problems. That can be really challenging for them to take those steps back and talk to the general person that isn't an expert in that particular area. They might be an expert in another particular area. So I think being able to engage the community in that way is really important. At Energy Lab, we spend a bit of time with social media and talking at panels and conferences to engage people into the startup ecosystem and what it is and how it works. And again, help them understand where the opportunities are for Australia and that they should get involved. That's incredibly important to take people on the journey, particularly if they're communities that are being impacted by what's happening in the transition. So for instance, I talked before about the transmission rollout and the need to build more transition. There's been terrible controversies around building transmission on farmer land, and running transmission straight through their land, particularly in Victoria. And that just says to me that the engagement hasn't been right with the community, that more needs to be done to engage with the community and figure out the right solution that's going to work for everybody. So in many, many different ways. So that might be transmission, it might be wind farms, it might be having a community battery at the end of your street. Community engagement and bringing people on the journey is incredibly important. And with 30% of households in Australia with solar on their roof, there's already a lot of engagement in this space. There's a lot of people that are already part of this ecosystem.
30%, that's pretty amazing.
It's incredible. Australia's done incredibly well, one of the highest, if not the highest in the world when it comes to engagement with solar. And there's many reasons for that, but it does from a startup perspective, it's put us in a really great position, because it means that a lot of the grid challenges, a lot of the business models that might not be available overseas because they don't have those sorts of things going on in their communities, they're available here. And our startups have learnt what those are, and they can export those learnings overseas. So it's been actually incredibly beneficial all round, aside from the renewable energy that's being used.
Now let's talk about inclusivity and equality. How has Energy Lab fostered diversity and inclusion within the startups it works with? And what benefits have you seen from this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting topic, particularly in this segment of the market. When you look at energy and the decarbonisation area and the truly technical STEM-based challenges that are being faced, there aren't as many women in general working in this sector as we would like to have. So that's number one challenge. The community that, as you start, is not representative of women anyway. But let's talk about general diversity. So there's the main thing that we're working on, that we've dedicated our time to, is our Women in Climate and Energy Fellowship. So we kicked off in 2017. In 2019, we launched this fellowship designed to help women launch their own startup. And the reason we did that is because we saw in the wonderful founder base that we were working with, there were not enough women. Less than 20%, the founders we were working with were women. It's not good enough. So when we're talking about the huge challenges that we've got to face to decarbonise the economy, we need all the minds, we need all the brilliant ideas, we need a diverse range of humans with diverse backgrounds, with diverse interests to come bring their brilliant ideas in so that we can solve all these really, really hard to solve challenges. So we therefore started up our Women in Climate and Energy Fellowship to help bring more women into the entrepreneurship, into startups. We've had 90 women go through that program so far, which is really great. We're really proud of it. It's a long journey. So we're not going to solve this in this year or next year. We're starting at that very early level with the women that we work with at the ideation level. So what's your idea? Can we validate it? And moving on from there. So it takes many years to have a startup that's building and growing when you start at that level, particularly in this space. So aside from the fact that there aren't enough women in the sector, when we look out a little bit of investment, last year across all sectors, it wouldn't be any better in this sector though, only 2% of venture capital funds went to women-led startups. I don't even know how that happens.
The first time I heard that statistics, I was so shocked.
Yeah, it's like, it can't just be an accidental mistake. It's really very dire. So again, this is why we want to work in this space, although there's many diversity challenges we need to focus on. But when I've done a lot of reading, research, talking on this area, and the key thing that stands out for women, it's not that they need help, that there's something wrong with them, but sometimes they don't have as much access to the people in power, because you need to get access to funding. And if you don't happen to have friends and family that can give you a lazy $20 or $30 or $50,000 to get you going on your startup, that means you can't get off the ground. If you don't happen to have access to the experts in this area, then that puts you behind absolutely as well. And if you don't have access to people with influence, that can also be difficult. And that's where we can help. So we have this amazing community, 300 mentors, 160 angel investors, all the VCs and the family offices that work in this space. So we can help introduce and connect women to those people that they need to speak to, as well as the amazing range of women that we already have in our network. I think the other thing holding people back in this space that needs working on, and we're trying a bit in this space, is around what is, and I mentioned it before, what is a stereotypical entrepreneur? So if people put that in their heads, quite often it's not a woman, it might be a young man, which in all instances is not true either. There's lots of different humans that come through as successful entrepreneurs. But it does mean that for many of us, there's an unconscious bias that comes to play when we're talking to a woman-led startup, when we're thinking of investing in a woman-led startup. So really sharing those stories of success, of successful women founders, of helping role model out to the rest of the community what success actually looks like for an entrepreneur, that it doesn't just look like that stereotypical view, it looks like all these different amazing things, is really important. It's something that we try and work on. As I mentioned, we haven't succeeded. There's still a lot of a journey to go. But for us, as I mentioned before, we want the best ideas to succeed. We want the ideas that are going to make the most impact, that are going to help us decarbonize, that are going to change the world to succeed, not just the ideas for the founders that have got the best connections.
That is so important, because I think part of it is being, if a founder goes and pitch and having that stereotype affect your chances of getting funding. And the other side is you select yourself out because, for example, maybe you think you are too old to start a company, or because you don't look like the images that we see in the media.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it is too. I must say, just to finish with the one thing that does irritate me slightly that I'm hoping we can solve, and it's all around this stereotypical. There's so many women founders that I've talked to that have told me how some of their trajectory changed when they brought on a male co-founder. That and as much as I'm sure that male co-founder was awesome, that's not right. That really does need to be worked through. So again, it's a journey. We've all got a part to play in that, where if you look on our blog, we've got some great stories of women founders on there that we like to promote and share, because there's some amazing work that's happening in that space.
So in responsible innovation, when we look at what is innovation excellence, we think about how can the benefits of a technology be fairly distributed across different people, right? Risks as well as benefits. So my question here is, how can we ensure that the benefits, maybe also risks, of clean energy transition are shared equally across all communities?
Yeah, so an equitable transition is something that gets talked about a lot. I think there's an opportunity to have more equity than what we've had before as we move from, I guess, if you think about energy in general, but the people that had the power, or the organizations that had all the power, it can look quite different with energy. We see that it's more distributed. 30% of households have solar on the roofs. We see that some of that power, that control is being more distributed. In terms of some of the startups that I see focusing in this area, because ultimately it's them that enact this. It's the new organizations that help enact this. So if I think of the incredible Good Car Company, they're actually they're going to be a 4-time alumni of our programs, because they're currently going through our lithium program as well, our Supercharge Australia program. So I love what they do. Firstly, they're trying to bring more or get more EVs in Australia. So they import secondhand or other EVs that are cheaper than some of the ones that you can certainly get in Australia, because until most recently we had some high-priced EVs. So they bring them in at a really reasonable cost. And then the other thing they do, which is amazing, is they do community bulk buys. So they go and talk to communities, they educate them about EVs, they get them to try one, so that more people have access to electric vehicles and reasonably priced electric vehicles. So that's important, because the electric vehicles are reasonably priced. But the other thing is important is that once you have an electric vehicle, the running costs are much lower than the running costs of an ICE vehicle. So when you talk about equity and justice, that's perfect. That's actually a perfect model where we're giving people that don't necessarily have the money for high running costs on a car a different entirely option. So those sorts of startups in this space are really key to creating more fairness and equity, but it's a hard thing to unwind. It's been many, many years of power bases being built up in this space. So it's going to take some time and lots of effort.
How can regulation assist in that process?
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. I think, well, for example, just sticking to that topic that we're on right now. So at the moment, the EVs that we have in Australia are pretty high priced. And one of the things that's stopping us from getting more EVs and more lower priced EVs from the various manufacturers from around the world is our lack of fuel efficiency standards. At the moment, no one's penalised for selling a really dirty vehicle. Actually, we've got some of the lowest fuel efficiency standards in the world. So by putting those fuel efficiency standards in place, the manufacturers and importers will do that in a very different way, which creates more access. So just in that one instance, you can see that regulation, something that you might not think of as closely, is definitely driving people's access to EVs.
I know that Indigenous representation and representation from underrepresented groups, as you mentioned before, in innovation solutions is something that you care deeply about. So I do have a question here about whether you can speak to any specific examples of how Energy Lab has supported startups founded or led by individuals from these groups. And if not, what's your vision around that subject?
Yeah, that's right. So we have supported some founders in this space, but not many, not merely enough. And I think it's more the desire and the passion to assist in this instance. Some of our Indigenous communities talk about fairness and equity and the ability for everybody to have access to cheap renewable power. Some of our Indigenous communities are still running on diesel. That's not good enough. That is unacceptable. So there's lots that needs to change in that space. In terms of Energy Lab, we're really passionate about seeing a diverse group of entrepreneurs succeed. So it's more of a desire to be able to support those different communities, those different groups, to be able to create their own businesses. Ultimately, for me, it'd be great to see an Indigenous own and run Energy Lab that could actually help Indigenous founders as well. I think that's the sort of maturity that we really need to see in this sector. And it's something that we're working towards in the background. I haven't got anything to announce right yet, but it's definitely something that we're working on because it's really important.
Now let's go to our topic number 3, which is something that you mentioned is very interesting. I think most people who work in the startup space have heard about the valley of death. And you mentioned previously that there are 2 valleys of death for Australian startups. So my first question here is, what are these? And what role do you see for government, investors, and other stakeholders in supporting startups through the valleys of death?
Oh, yes. So the first valley of death is the one for startups. So it's when they might fail in particular. There's I must say, many would say there's multiple valleys of death, but let's stick to the major ones. So the first one's definitely around MVP, so minimum viable product. So you've got product market fit to paying customers. So actually getting some cash in the door. That's the first valley of death. And when you're working in the space with the startups we work with, as you can imagine, it's much harder to get a pilot paid gravitational storage plant up and running than what it is to get some people to hit subscribe on an app. So it can be a long, extensive, difficult process. But the second valley of death, and we get to see it more now that we're working with later stage startups, is the one around moving out of pilot manufacturing or the pilot stage to a full growth stage. So high level manufacturing and lots of production occurring. And it does appear that we've not been very good at servicing this need locally for startups. We've had startups move overseas to get funding. And actually, this probably isn't that exact example, but the amazing Tritium. So Tritium do EV chargers. They're out of Brisbane. They're incredible. They actually recently last year listed on the NASDAQ. This is really, really exciting. So they're building a gigafactory over in the States. They're having huge levels of success. Now, I must say, even though they're listed on the NASDAQ, there's a lot of operations going on internationally. They still are Brisbane-based. Their head office is still here. Their CEO is still here. But for many others, they've had to do the flip, which is they can't get money to grow here. So they've had to go overseas and set up overseas. Actually, one of the founders that we're working with right now, Conry Tech, who do air conditioning, huge energy user, their previous company, they unfortunately had to move from Australia and go and set up in Canada. They were incredibly successful. So all of those jobs, all of that economic value went overseas. That is something we need to get better at. So there's numerous things around that. Bringing manufacturing back on shore is a huge focus for the federal government and many of the state governments. So we need to provide the support required for startups to be able to get those plants up and running. But it's also the funding in general. So it can be harder to get access to those larger funding envelopes from the venture capital organisations and family offices that exist in Australia. So unlocking more money in that space is really important. Next month, I'm presenting at the Climate Investor Forum held in Melbourne, which is the first one they've ever done. And it really is about unlocking a lot of the funding that we have in Australia, those bigger envelope sizes, so that we can put it towards climate tech. So that'll be a really interesting pathway to see if we can't start doing that. If we think about the enormous superannuation funds that we have in this country, being able to direct that in a way that is still profitable for the people whose super it is, but is also economy building, makes fantastic sense. So being able to work on that is really important.
So it sounds like we do have the capital in Australia. We just need to unlock the capital that we already have. Is that correct? Because sometimes we hear about how, for example, because we only have a small population, for example, and our institutions are smaller, therefore they need to go to like Singapore or other countries to raise funding. So it sounds like is that the case or not so much?
Well, I think our population is small, but the markets our startups can tackle is the world. So we've definitely got the market size to go after. It is available. And in terms of the organisations that we work with, our super funds are enormous. They definitely have access. And many of the funds raised look outside of the country to do that as well for their raising of funds. So the money is here. There's definitely more to unlock than is what is available right now. And maybe partnerships with overseas players would be a great idea to top things up. But really supporting startups to not have to flip and move overseas and lose all of that economic value and that knowledge. We talked about the community. When that founder goes overseas, we lose access to them and all of their learning so that we can build up the next round of founders and innovations and technology that we require.
Are there ecosystems out there we can learn from to actually make sure that our companies don't go overseas?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of actually Startup Genome does an amazing report. I think they did it the year before last, so it might have been 2021, but they do a report on the top clean tech ecosystems around the world. So it's not like we don't know who they are. So San Francisco, no surprise, Tel Aviv, no surprise, Los Angeles, Amsterdam, Stockholm are some of the top ecosystems on the list. So learning from them is absolutely available and at our fingertips. So the partner we have, New Energy Nexus, they're based in San Francisco, and in New York. So there's actually Berlin's an amazing ecosystem as well. They're also based in Berlin. So yes, we can learn from those ecosystems. There are so many things that we don't do in this country that we should do. So in California, for example, they have non-dilutive funding arrangements that are easy to access, that don't require one-to-one. So a lot of the challenge that we have here is early on, a founder, they want funding. They don't always want to give up all of their equity at that very early time, or it's not the right time and they'll end up giving up too much equity if they raise at the wrong time. So non-dilutive grants that aren't taking equity, that don't require one-to-one matching. A lot of them say, we'll give you $1 if you've got $1, which again is a big challenge, is important. So a lot of these overseas ecosystems, such as California, have those sorts of large grants available. So there are many things that we could do to improve the support that we have for founders in Australia. If we're really serious about supporting the startups, there's definitely more that needs to be put in place.
The second question for this topic is, how can startups mitigate the risks associated with these two stages of the innovation life cycle? And what advice would you have for entrepreneurs who are facing these challenges?
Yeah, that's right. So the first phase is, and actually maybe I'm going to stick with the second valley of death, actually, because we've been talking about that a bit. It's early on to make sure that you're building and developing your expansion opportunities. So whether it be here or overseas, make sure you've got a healthy pipeline of opportunity laid out before you. Because that will encourage investors to come on board when they can see how healthy and how developed you are in terms of your connections, both in Australia and overseas. So that's one mitigating factor. Be very planned around that. And make sure you're going after the grants that are available. I know there needs to be more, but take the time to understand the grants that are available in each of the different states and communities and find out which ones are best for you and give yourself the time to go after them. If you're getting closer to wanting to build up, well, then the accelerating commercialization grant, the $1 million, you'll need to start that about a year before you actually need the money. That's the timelines around it. So understand the timelines to get the money and the support. Build the relationships with the key investors that have that sort of funding early on. So there's some of the mitigations that I would recommend for founders to go after to really minimize that risk for them.
Okay. Last topic number 4 is corporate innovation and transformation. I ask this question because you have spent many years in large corporates and now you're helping startups. So the question here is, how can established companies foster a culture of innovation and risk-taking while also maintain their core business operations?
That's right. That's true. And they need to be able to do both. Any organization that thinks they can't do both is confused. And the ideal scenario is that you do it together. The model where you have the existing company and then there's the innovation area over on the side, that is not recommended in terms of really fostering innovation throughout a whole organization and making sure that the base of the company is supportive. Otherwise, there becomes a have-nots. Oh, we get to innovate, the rest of you don't, which can create lots of tension. So the key thing for me is to make sure that it's a cultural thing throughout the whole company. The innovation is part of everyone's job. And to make that true, people need permission to be able to do that. They need to feel comfortable stepping into something where they don't know the answer, because that's what innovation is. They need permission to do that. They need to be not told off for the sake of a better world. They need to be not punished or penalized if the innovation they're working on fails, because that's part of innovation. So setting up that understanding, that boundaries, those permission is essential for any organization to want to innovate and to create a culture of innovation. The other thing for me is to get your head out of the sand as an organization. So rather than looking internally and wondering what it is we're doing internally and trying to focus on your own problems, look outside. There's this amazing innovation ecosystem sitting out about you. There are R&D experts at our universities, at our science bodies. There are amazing startups that are operating in this space. There are international organizations that are doing more interesting things than you might be. So go out there and learn and bring that back. And I can't believe I didn't mention it. There are customers that are asking for things from you, so don't ever forget them. So just keep that external view happening would probably be a key recommendation. And in terms of some of my hints for what that might be, for those innovating in a company. So if you're doing it, how should you do it? The first thing is to make sure whatever you're working on has a strategic link. So it's in your key strategy documents that there's an executive in your organization or a senior person that believes that is important, because you'll need support to innovate, because it's never easy. So make sure you start with that first. The other thing is that there'll always be somebody that will tell you that it won't work. Or there might be somebody as well, just as equally, that'll tell you it's brilliant. So you'll get this diverse feedback on whatever it is that you're working on. So no matter who they are and what they say, listen to them and validate it from your own perspective, validate it with other people. There could be insight in it that'll either help you succeed or not, and only you can decide what the truth is and what the real facts are. So just keep that open mind to make sure that you're validating any feedback. But I must say, if I took notice of every negative person that ever said, no, you can't, you have to stop, I would never have done any innovation in any organization that I've worked with. The last hint for me is to roll up your sleeves, is to get in and under the innovation area that it is that you're working on, whether you're transforming it, innovating it, or disrupting it. So really understand that problem, really sit in it and understand the ins and outs to develop your gut feel. So that as you go along, you get a feeling for what's right and what's wrong. You can still investigate it, but you get more of a feel of whether or not it's the right thing. And some of the best innovators and founders that I've seen have come from inside an industry. They've really already sat in that problem, and they're innovating on something that they truly understand. So they're my 3 tips for if you're innovating in an organization.
My last question before we go to the closing questions is, you mentioned in your bio that you changed from a corporate world to the not-for-profit to make more of an impact. So my question is, from your view, how can corporates make that impact, be able to embed impact when they innovate in the first place, so they don't lose out people like you, who had to transition?
Yeah, to switch. And so my journey, I started working with startups in corporate. In a large corporate, I was working with startups, and I flipped into a non-profit, still working with startups, which I'm incredibly happy to do. It's great to be working on something that's really, really mission driven. And I think that's the secret. So if innovation is important, innovation to an organization, for those working on innovation, it's heavy lifting, it's really challenging, it's risk taking. For some people, it can be risking their careers. They might feel like they're risking their career if something might go wrong, if the organization doesn't take that as a learning as opposed to a disaster. So setting up those pathways that help people succeed is important and rewards them for innovation, and just making sure that it's connected to some higher purpose. I think that's the key. If it's just about profits and bottom line in an organization, I think you're highly likely to lose people that are interested in impact. So they want something more. And lots of organizations are working on their ESG strategies. They're working out how they sit in the community, what they're doing for the environment. That's really important. So help people connect those 2 things and be truly genuine about it. Corporate profits are not enough for people that are looking for impact. They want to see more impact on the environment, more great impact with communities. So that would be my recommendation.
We have a tradition on our program whereby we ask 3 questions, more personal journey questions, to close our interview. The first question I have for you is, tell us a story only you can tell.
Okay. All right. So I have thought about this one, which is a little bit of fun. So I went to uni in the early 90s, no judgment. And I had to drive well over an hour to get to university from where I lived. And it was in my little red Mazda 323 at the time that was nicknamed Lipstick, because it was a fantastic red color, I might say. And back in those days, Triple J was definitely my friend, whereas probably ABC would probably be more of my friend now. But Triple J was definitely my friend back then. My car didn't have a tape deck. It definitely didn't have a CD player. That wasn't really a thing back then. It certainly didn't have air conditioning either. So for me, the radio was definitely the best option. So in between listening to the bands that were around then, so Silverchair and UMI and Nirvana, I really love listening to the stories. Like Triple J did do great deep dives into particular technologies and particular stories that were of interest to people back then. And I love listening to the ones that were about technology and the environment. I've always enjoyed both. And one of the ones that I most enjoyed was the discussion around EVs, because it brought together both. So there was in the early 90s discussion around EVs because it had the environmental impact as well as the cool technology, which was really exciting. So the opportunity to stop using the dirty fuels and to move to a new solution, to me, it sounded really amazing. And I remember the frustration back then. It's like, why is this not happening? Now, we know technically the batteries weren't available back then, but why wasn't it happening, and why wasn't it happening quickly enough? So that really drew my attention. I love the theories around conspiracy theories as to why it wasn't developing the way that it should have been. So that really stuck in my mind. And it was 25 years later, I think I've counted right, that I got to have my first ride in a Tesla.
Oh, wow.
All those years later. And then not long after that, actually, I was searching for my next gig. And that ended up being, because I'd been in media for quite some time, and that ended up being in the organisation where I got to work with startups in renewables and working on EV innovation projects. So it took me a really long time to get back to what I was listening to in that little red car all that time ago. But it's really great to have the privilege to be finally working on that transition and that innovation and that transformation. So that's my little story of when I was much younger.
And when you thought about your journey, what do you think you learned about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always loved doing innovation. It's incredibly exciting work, no matter what it is that I'm innovating on, changing something that's in front of me, working with people to bring them on the journey. I love doing it. But what I've learned about myself is when you add, I guess, a more clear purpose around the environment and the economy, well, that just takes it to the next level. So throughout my career, I've got to work on innovation. I've loved it. But now I get to add that extra thing in. And it turned out that I knew about it all the way back then. It just took me a while to find it.
My second question is, teach us a lesson only you can teach.
Yes. So this one for me, and it's relevant in so many situations. It would have been a year or so ago, I listened to the Long Now podcast. So it's a US-based podcast. And there was a lady called Julia Gillette who was talking about the soldier versus scout mindset. And she'd done a whole lot of research into these two different mindsets. And it was just really interesting. But the key thing, without diving into what was an hour-long podcast, was that the soldier mindset is all about defending the position that you're in. So I've got this idea in my head, I'm going to defend it at all costs. It's a very political way of operating. I'm going to bat those things away and defend it, and I'm right, and I'm going to make sure that stays that way. Whereas the scout mindset is about, so a scout, a soldier obviously defends, a scout goes out and looks and they see what's around and they bring that back to everybody so that they can understand what's going on outside them. So it's the scout mindset that can understand, that can learn, that can take into account different information. So my lesson for everyone is be conscious of what mindset you're in and how you're behaving when new and different information comes to you. Is it a scout or a soldier mindset? Which one should you be in? Make the right choice.
That's a really great lesson.
It is, and it's hard, right? Because being right can be a thing. I certainly suffer from that too often, I would say. So really having your brain open at the right time to take in new information and slightly adjust that position is so important. And it's definitely important as we're trying to work on these really big problems.
And the last question is, in Vision 2050, what would you hope it to look like, feel like, and sound like?
Right, it's a long way away, isn't it? Although I know it won't take long to get there. Time certainly flies. I'll potentially be retired by then. But anyway, let's see. Board position. So firstly, I think the main thing, given what I'm passionate about and working on, is that we've averted some of the most severe climate change impacts that are coming our way, that we've stopped the damage that we've been doing to this planet, and that we're even better, we're actually working to reverse it. That technology has advanced so much that we can reverse some of the damage that we've actually done. But for Australia, what I want to see is this thriving economy where innovation is our thing, and we are that renewable energy superpower, that we've got startups thriving, the economy's thriving, that we're exporting our genius to the rest of the world and really playing our part, that we've got a bunch of talented, diverse startups that are hiring people and building the economy and really driving change and interest and excitement and sharing that with the rest of the world around what we did so right to get there. And for me, I just hope that Energy Labs played an amazing part in helping some of those startups on their journey. That's the dream. That's why we do what we do.
This is Megan Fisher, the CEO of Energy Lab based in Melbourne, Australia, doing great things. I am so thankful for your time, and I think there's so much more to unpack, and I wish we had more time. For those people who want to find out more about Megan, you can go and just type her name into LinkedIn, or you can go to Energy Lab's website, which is energylab.org.au. So thank you so much for your time. I hope we get to speak again in the future.
Thanks, Shell. I love the chat. It was just really exciting. So thank you for sharing the time with me.